Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Take a moment to settle in, to let the day fall away from your shoulders. Get comfortable wherever you are. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet room where the evening has finally settled. A cozy corner where you can finally rest. Tonight we're going to explore the Gupta Empire, a civilization that flourished in India between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. This was a time when mathematics found its voice, when sculpture became poetry in stone, when universities drew scholars from across the known world. We'll discover how a dynasty emerged from the ashes of fragmentation to unite much of northern India, understand how art and science flourished together under their rule, and contemplate what it means when a civilization reaches its fullest expression. It's a journey that spans nearly 3 centuries and touches everything from the invention of zero to the creation of some of humanity's most exquisite art. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a rapid tour through dates and battles. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through this golden age, taking our time with each discovery, each innovation, each quiet revolution in thought and form. We'll meet the rulers who fostered this flowering, the scholars who expanded human knowledge, and the artists whose works still speak across 1500 years. By the end, I think you'll find that the Gupta period offers something profound about what civilizations can achieve when curiosity and creativity are given room to breathe. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's quieter triumphs, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of curious minds. So settle in, let your breathing slow, take a deep breath and let it out slowly. And let's begin our slow drift through India's golden age. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to solve. Just listen, and let the story of the Gupta Empire unfold like a scroll being carefully unrolled, revealing its treasures one quiet moment at a time. To understand the Gupta Empire, we need to begin in the centuries before it emerged, in a time when the Indian subcontinent was divided into countless kingdoms and territories, each with its own rulers, its own ambitions, its own story. The great Maurya Empire, which had once unified much of India under Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had long since crumbled. What remained was a patchwork of competing powers, from the Indo-Greek kingdoms in the northwest to regional dynasties scattered across the Gangetic plain. This fragmentation wasn't necessarily chaos. Many of these smaller kingdoms were prosperous, cultured, centres of learning and trade in their own right. But there was no single vision, no unified political structure to coordinate defence, facilitate commerce across regions, or provide the stability that allows culture to truly flourish. The Kushana Empire had provided some unity in the north, but by the 3rd century of the Common Era, even that was dissolving into smaller successor states. And this brings us to something equally remarkable about historical change. Great empires don't usually emerge from the most powerful of these fragments. They often rise from unexpected places, from lesser kingdoms that possess something more valuable than mere military might. They possess vision, administrative skill, the ability to inspire loyalty not just through force, but through the promise of something better. The Gupta dynasty would prove to be exactly this kind of unexpected flowering. In the early 4th century, in the region of Magadha in northeastern India, a ruler named Chandragupta established what would become one of history's most culturally significant empires. We know frustratingly little about Chandragupta himself. The historical record is sparse, fragmented, built from inscriptions and coins and later chronicles that sometimes blur legend with fact. But what matters is that he established a foundation, a small kingdom that his successors would transform into something extraordinary. His son, Ghatotkacha, continued building this foundation, expanding the kingdom's territory and influence gradually, carefully. These weren't dramatic conquests. They were patient accumulations of power, strategic marriages, careful diplomacy, the slow work of turning a regional kingdom into something that could support larger ambitions. Neither Sri Gupta nor Ghatotkacha called themselves emperors. They understood their place in the hierarchy of Indian politics, used the title Maharaja, Great King, rather than claiming universal sovereignty. But they were preparing the ground for something magnificent. They were building the administrative structures, the economic base, the network of alliances that would allow their descendants to reach for greatness. Sometimes the most important historical moments are these quiet preparations, these decades of patient work that make the dramatic flowering possible. And so, we find ourselves, gently, at the threshold of the Gupta Golden Age. As a third generation prepares to transform a regional kingdom into an empire that would define an entire era of Indian civilization. Around 320 of the Common Era, a young man named Chandragupta took the throne of the Gupta kingdom. He was the grandson of Sri Gupta, and he would be the first of his line to truly deserve the title of emperor. But Chandragupta I understood something fundamental about power in ancient India. Military conquest alone wouldn't build a lasting empire. What he needed was legitimacy, connection to established power structures, the kind of alliance that would make other kingdoms see the Guptas not as upstarts, but as rightful inheritors of sovereignty. He found this through marriage. Chandragupta I married a princess named Kumaradevi from the Lichavi clan, an ancient and respected family that had ruled in the region for generations. The Lichavis had a history stretching back centuries, had been mentioned in Buddhist texts, were associated with republican traditions and deep-rooted regional authority. By marrying into this family, Chandragupta wasn't just acquiring an alliance, he was acquiring legitimacy, a connection to ancient power that transformed his dynasty from regional rulers into something with deeper historical roots. The importance of this marriage can be seen in something remarkable. Chandragupta I issued coins that showed both himself and his queen, a highly unusual practice that proclaimed to the world the significance of this union. These weren't merely personal mementos. They were political statements, declarations that the Gupta dynasty, now united two great lineages, combined the Gupta administrative skill with Lichavi prestige and regional influence. Building on this foundation, we can now explore how Chandragupta I began expanding his territory. He moved carefully, strategically, bringing neighbouring kingdoms under Gupta control through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic skill. He understood that rapid conquest created resentment and instability, while patient expansion allowed new territories to be properly integrated, their elites incorporated into the Gupta system, their traditions respected rather than crushed. This connects to something I find deeply fascinating about successful empire building. The empires that endure aren't usually those built through overwhelming force. They're built through systems that give local rulers reasons to cooperate, that preserve regional identities while creating overarching loyalty to the empire. Chandragupta I was creating exactly this kind of structure, building an empire that could accommodate diversity while maintaining central authority. By the time of his death around 335, Chandragupta I had transformed the Gupta kingdom into a genuine empire controlling much of the eastern Gangetic plain. He had established a capital at Pataliputra, the ancient city that had once been the Mauryan capital, symbolically claiming continuity with India's imperial past. He had created administrative structures that could govern this expanded territory effectively, and perhaps most importantly, he had created the conditions for cultural flowering, the stability and prosperity that would allow his successors to patronize art and learning on an unprecedented scale. His reign marked a turning point. The moment when the Gupta dynasty moved from being one regional power among many to being the dominant force in northern India. And this is where our journey takes an interesting turn, as we move from the founder of empire to the warrior who would expand it further, from careful state building to dramatic military achievement that would echo through the centuries. Chandragupta I chose his successor carefully. He had multiple sons, but the one he selected for the throne was Samudragupta, a prince who combined military brilliance with cultural sophistication. The choice wasn't automatic. In ancient India, succession often involved competition between royal sons, political manoeuvring, sometimes civil war. But Chandragupta I's choice was accepted, suggesting both his personal authority and Samudragupta's evident capabilities. Samudragupta took the throne around 335 and would rule for approximately 45 years, transforming the Gupta Empire from a regional power into the dominant force across much of the Indian subcontinent. The sources for his reign are far richer than for his predecessors, particularly the famous Allahabad pillar inscription, a detailed account of his achievements inscribed on a pillar that had originally been erected by Ashoka centuries earlier. This inscription, composed by the court poet Harisena, provides a window into Samudragupta's military campaigns and political vision. It describes a ruler who conducted two major types of campaigns. In the Gangetic heartland, he pursued a policy of complete conquest, directly annexing kingdoms and bringing them under central Gupta administration. But in more distant regions, particularly in southern India and along the periphery of his empire, he pursued a different approach, which leads us naturally to consider his southern campaign. Samudragupta led his armies deep into southern India, defeating numerous kingdoms along the way. The inscription lists rulers with names like Mahendra of Kosala, Vyagharaja of Mahakantara, Mahendragiri of Pishtapura, each representing a kingdom that fell before Gupta military might. But rather than attempting to hold these distant territories, Samudragupta allowed the defeated rulers to continue governing as vassals, requiring only tribute and acknowledgement of Gupta overlordship. This was strategic brilliance. Administering distant territories would have overstretched Gupta resources, created endless rebellions, required permanent military occupation. By allowing local rulers to maintain their thrones in exchange for recognition of Gupta supremacy, Samudragupta created a sphere of influence without the burden of direct administration. These vassal kings would pay tribute, acknowledge Gupta sovereignty, but otherwise govern as they had before, creating a stable buffer zone around the empire's core. But there's another layer to consider about Samudragupta's achievements. He wasn't merely a conqueror. The sources describe him as an accomplished musician, a poet, a patron of learning and the arts. Coins from his reign show him playing the veena, a stringed instrument, an unusual image for a warrior king, but one that reveals his self-conception. He saw no contradiction between military prowess and cultural refinement, between expanding territory through force and fostering learning through patronage. This combination of warrior and patron would become characteristic of the Gupta Golden Age. The stability created by military success provided the foundation for cultural achievement. The wealth from conquest and tribute-funded universities supported scholars, patronized artists and craftsmen. Samudragupta understood that a great empire required more than military might. It required the kind of cultural sophistication that would make people want to be part of the empire, that would make Gupta rule synonymous with civilization itself. By the time of his death around 380, Samudragupta had expanded the Gupta Empire to its greatest territorial extent, creating a realm that stretched from the Himalayas to the Narmada River. From the western coast to the borders of Bengal, he had established the Guptas as the paramount power in India, had created the conditions for an unprecedented cultural flowering, had set the stage for what would come next. And it's this very achievement that leads us to our next discovery, to the reign that would see the Gupta Golden Age reach its fullest brilliance. Around 380, the Gupta throne passed to Chandragupta II, who would come to be known as Vikramaditya, the son of valour. His reign, lasting until approximately 415, would see the Gupta Empire reach its cultural zenith, becoming a centre of learning, art and scientific achievement that drew admiration from across the known world. The military conquests of his father and grandfather had created the foundation, but Chandragupta II would build something more enduring than military dominance. He would build a cultural flowering that would define an entire age. His major military achievement was the conquest of the Western satraps, the last significant Indo-Scythian kingdom that controlled the valuable ports and trade routes of Western India. This wasn't merely territorial expansion. Control of these ports meant control of maritime trade with the Roman Empire, with East Africa, with Southeast Asia. It meant wealth flowing into Gupta coffers, ideas and goods from distant lands enriching Gupta culture. Connections with civilizations as far away as the Mediterranean. The integration of these western territories brought new prosperity to the empire. The ports of Gujarat became gateways through which Roman gold coins flowed in exchange for Indian spices, textiles, gems, and exotic goods. This wasn't one-sided trade. Indian merchants and goods were prized throughout the Roman world, mentioned in Roman texts, depicted in Roman art, integrated into Roman elite culture. And this connects to something equally important about Chandragupta II's administration. He maintained the efficient bureaucracy his predecessors had built, appointing capable administrators to key positions, ensuring that the expanded empire functioned smoothly. He established his court at Ujjain, in the Malwa region of central India, a strategic location that allowed him to oversee both the traditional Gupta heartland in the east and the newly conquered western territories. But what truly distinguished Chandragupta II's reign was his patronage of learning and the arts. His court became home to the 9 Gems, a legendary assembly of scholars, poets, and intellectuals. Among them was Kalidasa, perhaps the greatest poet and dramatist in classical Sanskrit literature. Kalidasa's works, plays like Shakuntala, and poems like Meghaduta, the Cloud Messenger, represent the pinnacle of Sanskrit literary achievement, works of such beauty and refinement that they've been translated and admired for 15 centuries. Building on this, we can understand how the Gupta court became a magnet for talent from across India and beyond. Scholars came to study, artists to find patronage, religious thinkers to debate and develop their philosophies. This wasn't accidental. Chandragupta II actively cultivated this atmosphere, providing the financial support and intellectual freedom that allows creativity to flourish. He understood that a great empire is measured not just by its territory, but by its cultural achievements, by what it creates that endures beyond military power. This, in turn, leads us to think about religious policy under the Guptas. Chandragupta II was a Hindu, worshipped Vishnu particularly, issued coins showing Garuda, Vishnu's eagle mount. But his empire was religiously diverse, home to Buddhists, Jains, various Hindu sects, even smaller religious communities. The Gupta approach was one of tolerance and patronage across religious lines. Buddhist monasteries received royal support, Jain temples were built, diverse religious communities coexisted peacefully. This religious tolerance contributed to the empire's stability and cultural richness. Different religious traditions could flourish, each contributing its own perspective, its own artistic and intellectual traditions to the broader Gupta culture. Buddhist cave temples at Ajanta were expanded during this period, their walls covered with paintings that rank among the finest achievements of ancient Indian art. Hindu temple architecture developed new forms and sophistication. Intellectual debates between different schools of philosophy enriched Indian thought. Let that thought settle as we move forward to explore the world beyond the court and the capital, the daily life that unfolded across this vast and culturally rich empire, the ways ordinary people experienced this golden age. While kings and scholars occupied the historical record, the Gupta Empire was built on the lives of millions of ordinary people, farmers and merchants, craftspeople and labourers, women managing households and men working fields that had been cultivated for countless generations. To understand the Golden Age, we need to step away from courts and campaigns and consider how life actually felt for those who lived through it. Most people in the Gupta Empire were farmers, living in villages that dotted the landscape, growing rice and wheat and pulses, maintaining the agricultural base that supported everything else. The village was the fundamental unit of social organisation, often self-governing through councils of elders, maintaining its own customs and traditions within the larger framework of empire. Life followed the rhythms of seasons, planting and harvest, monsoons and dry periods that determined prosperity or hardship. The Gupta period saw improvements in agricultural techniques and irrigation. New lands were brought under cultivation, irrigation systems were expanded and maintained, agricultural productivity increased enough to support not just farmers, but also the cities, the armies, the scholars and artists who depended on agricultural surplus. This wasn't dramatic technological revolution, but rather the careful refinement and expansion of existing practices, the kind of incremental improvement that accumulates into significant change over generations. Villages were organized by caste and occupation, a social structure that provided identity and community, but also rigidity and hierarchy. A person's occupation was largely determined by birth, their social position inherited from their parents, their marriage prospects and daily interactions shaped by these inherited categories. This system was deeply embedded in Gupta society, reinforced by religious texts and legal codes that prescribe different duties and rights for different groups. But there's another dimension to this structure worth exploring. Within these constraints, people built meaningful lives, found joy in festivals and family, took pride in their crafts and skills. A potter might spend a lifetime perfecting techniques passed down through generations, creating vessels of genuine beauty alongside utilitarian wares. A weaver might develop patterns that became local traditions, cloth that was prized for its quality and design. Cities offered different possibilities. Pataliputra, Ujjain, Varanasi, cities along trade routes and administrative centres, were cosmopolitan places where different communities mingled, where wealth from trade created opportunities for social mobility, where ideas circulated more freely than in rural villages. Merchants formed powerful guilds that regulated trade and craftsmanship, maintained quality standards, provided mutual support and collective bargaining power. These guilds sometimes became wealthy enough to patronize religious institutions and public works, becoming centers of power in their own right. The Gupta period saw increasing trade, both within India and internationally. Merchants travelled established routes carrying textiles and spices, gems and metalwork, bringing back gold and horses, exotic goods and foreign ideas. This trade created wealth that filtered through the economy, supporting craftspeople who made the goods being traded, labourers who moved them, administrators who taxed them, rulers who used the revenue to maintain the system. Women's lives in the Gupta period were varied and complex, shaped by class and region as much as by gender. Elite women could be educated, could participate in religious and cultural life, could exercise influence within their families and sometimes beyond. Sources mention women who were accomplished in arts and learning, who managed estates, who participated in religious patronage. But most women's lives were more constrained, shaped by duties of household management and childbearing, by expectations that varied between castes and regions but generally limited women's public roles and independence. The Gupta law codes, like the famous Manusmriti that was compiled around this period, prescribed patriarchal family structures and gender hierarchy. Women were to be under the protection and authority of fathers, then husbands, then sons, never fully autonomous. Marriage was arranged, often at young ages, and while some sources describe loving marriages and respected wives, the legal and social structure fundamentally subordinated women to male authority. And perhaps this is what matters most about understanding daily life in any historical period. It was neither uniformly golden nor universally oppressive, but rather a complex reality where privilege and constraint, opportunity and limitation, joy and suffering coexisted in ways that varied enormously depending on one's position in the social hierarchy. The Golden Age was truly golden for some, provided security and modest prosperity for many, and remained difficult and constrained for others. This nuanced understanding helps us appreciate both the achievements of the period and the human costs of the systems that made those achievements possible, as we move gently toward exploring the intellectual and cultural triumphs that gave this age its enduring reputation. Among the Gupta period's many achievements, one stands out for its profound and lasting impact on human civilization. In the 5th century, Indian mathematicians developed a concept that would revolutionize mathematics and make modern science possible. They invented the concept of zero not just as a placeholder, but as a number in its own right, a symbol for absence that could be manipulated mathematically just like any other number. This might seem like a small thing, but consider what mathematics was like without zero. Roman numerals, the system used across the Mediterranean world, had no zero. There was no symbol for nothing, no way to represent absence mathematically. This made certain calculations extraordinarily difficult, made the development of advanced mathematics nearly impossible. The Indian innovation of treating zero as a number that could be added, subtracted, and manipulated opened entirely new mathematical possibilities. The earliest confirmed use of zero as a number appears in Indian inscriptions from the Gupta period, written in the place-value decimal system that Indian mathematicians had developed. In this system, the position of a digit determined its value, a concept that required a symbol for empty positions. Zero filled this role, but Indian mathematicians went further, exploring zero's mathematical properties, understanding that multiplying by zero yields zero, that adding zero leaves a number unchanged, that division by zero presents special problems, which helps explain why this innovation was so revolutionary. The Indian decimal place value system with zero spread gradually through the Islamic world, where mathematicians recognized its superiority to other number systems and adopted it enthusiastically. Arabic scholars translated Indian mathematical texts, incorporated Indian techniques into their own mathematical traditions, and eventually transmitted these innovations to medieval Europe. What we call Arabic numerals are actually Indian numerals transmitted through the Arabic-speaking world to Europe. This in turn leads us to understand the broader mathematical achievements of the Gupta period. Mathematicians like Aryabhata, working in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, made advances in algebra, trigonometry, and astronomy. Aryabhata calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places, understood the concept of place value, worked with very large numbers and fractions, developed methods for solving quadratic equations. His astronomical treatise, the Aryabhatiya, compiled in 499, contained remarkably sophisticated mathematics applied to celestial phenomena. He calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the modern value, understood that the Earth rotates on its axis, proposed a heliocentric model for the movements of planets, though this wasn't widely adopted. His work showed the close relationship between mathematics and astronomy in Indian scientific tradition, the way mathematical techniques were developed to solve astronomical problems. But there's a quieter story unfolding alongside this mathematical brilliance. These advances weren't occurring in isolation, but within a broader cultural context that valued education, supported scholars, created institutions where knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. The Gupta period saw the establishment and expansion of centres of learning where students studied not just mathematics and astronomy, but also grammar, philosophy, medicine, and literature. Mathematical knowledge was transmitted through texts and commentary, through direct teaching from master to student, through schools and universities that maintained living traditions of learning. Zero wasn't invented by a single person in a moment of inspiration, but emerged from a mathematical culture that was asking certain questions, working through certain problems, building on generations of earlier work. The Gupta period provided the stability and patronage that allowed this mathematical tradition to flourish and make its breakthrough innovations. What we're left with is not an answer to who invented zero, but a feeling that it emerged from a specific time and place where the conditions were right, where mathematical questions were being pursued rigorously, where scholars had the support and freedom to explore abstract concepts, where the cultural value placed on learning created space for pure intellectual achievement. And so we come to understand, slowly, how the Gupta Golden Age was built not just on conquest and trade, but on a profound commitment to learning and intellectual exploration, which brings us gently to the question of how this commitment manifested in the great centres of learning themselves. In the northeastern corner of the Gupta Empire, in the kingdom of Magadha where the dynasty had its origins, there arose a centre of learning that would become legendary. Nalanda, established during the Gupta period, would grow into perhaps the world's first true university, a place where thousands of students from across Asia came to study, where knowledge was systematically organised and transmitted, where scholarship reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for many centuries. Nalanda wasn't built all at once. It began as a monastery, one of many Buddhist institutions that dotted the landscape of northern India. But under Gupta patronage, it expanded dramatically. Successive emperors endowed it with lands and funds, built new structures, supported scholars and students. By the 6th century, it had become a vast complex of monasteries, temples, lecture halls, and libraries, home to thousands of monks and students. The curriculum at Nalanda was remarkably comprehensive. Students studied Buddhist philosophy and texts naturally, but also grammar, logic, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and other subjects considered essential to a complete education. The education was rigorous, requiring years of study, progressing through increasingly advanced texts and concepts, producing graduates who were renowned for their learning across Asia. Imagine, if you will, what it might have been like to arrive at Nalanda as a young student. You would have entered through gates guarded by learned monks who would test your knowledge before admitting you, ensuring that only serious students were accepted. Inside, you would find a vast complex of buildings, some several stories tall, arranged around courtyards where students debated and discussed. You would be assigned to a monastery, given a small room, expected to maintain monastic discipline even while pursuing your studies. Your day would begin early, with meditation and prayers, followed by lectures and discussions that could last for hours. Teachers would expound on texts, line by line, word by word, exploring every nuance of meaning. Students would debate with each other, testing their understanding, learning to think critically and argue persuasively. Building on this foundation, we can understand how Nalanda became truly international in its scope. Chinese pilgrims who visited India to study Buddhism often came to Nalanda, spending years there, learning Sanskrit, studying texts, participating in the scholarly community. The most famous of these was Xuanzang, who spent years at Nalanda in the 7th century, studying with the great scholar Silabhadra, and later wrote detailed accounts of his time there. These accounts describe a university with multiple libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, with lecture halls that could hold hundreds of students, with sophisticated administrative structures managing the complex's resources and activities. They describe debates where scholars from different schools of thought argued their positions, where logical rigour was prized, where intellectual honesty was expected even when discussing contrary positions. The libraries at Nalanda were legendary. They were housed in buildings called the Dharmaganja, the Treasury of Truth, and contained texts on every subject studied at the university. These weren't just Buddhist texts, but also Hindu philosophical works, scientific treatises, medical texts, works of literature and poetry, documents in multiple languages. Maintaining these libraries required teams of copyists, conservators, cataloguers, an entire infrastructure dedicated to preserving and organising knowledge. This connects to something I find deeply fascinating about how civilizations preserve and transmit knowledge. Before printing, before modern information technology, knowledge existed in fragile manuscripts that could be lost to fire, flood, insects, simple neglect. Institutions like Nalanda represented massive societal investments in knowledge preservation, commitment of resources to maintain libraries, and support scholars whose work might have no immediate practical application. The Gupta Empire and the Buddhist institutions it supported understood that knowledge is valuable even when it doesn't produce immediate utility. that scholarship and learning are worth supporting for their own sake. This understanding created the conditions for intellectual achievement, for the kind of deep inquiry that occasionally produces breakthroughs, but more often simply advances human understanding incrementally, steadily. Building foundations on which later generations would build. Let's rest here for a moment with this thought. In an age without modern technology, without printing presses or digital storage, knowledge depended entirely on human institutions and dedication. Every text at Nalanda represented hours of careful copying. Every student represented years of supported study. Every scholarly debate represented a society that valued learning enough to support it materially. And this brings us naturally to consider not just how knowledge was preserved, but how it was applied, particularly in the vital field of medicine that touched every life in the empire. The Gupta period saw significant developments in Indian medicine, building on ancient traditions codified in texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, while making new observations and refining treatments. Indian physicians of this era possessed sophisticated knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical techniques, knowledge that was both theoretical and deeply practical, built on centuries of observation and experience. The Indian medical tradition, known as Ayurveda, understood health as balance between three fundamental substances or humours called doshas: vata, associated with air and movement; pitta, associated with fire and transformation; and kapha, associated with water and structure. Disease was understood as imbalance between these humours, and treatment aimed at restoring balance through diet, herbal medicines, and various therapies. This might sound purely theoretical, but Ayurvedic medicine included extensive practical knowledge. The Sushruta Samhita, compiled in the centuries before the Gupta period but studied and practiced during it, described sophisticated surgical procedures. It detailed techniques for removing bladder stones, performing cataract surgery, reconstructing noses damaged in injury or punishment, setting broken bones, extracting teeth. These weren't just theoretical descriptions, but practical guides developed through actual practice, which leads us naturally to consider the pharmacological knowledge embedded in these medical texts. Indian physicians had identified hundreds of medicinal plants, minerals, and animal products, understanding their properties and appropriate uses. They had developed complex formulations combining multiple ingredients, understanding synergistic effects, knowing how to prepare medicines to maximize efficacy while minimizing harmful effects. Some of this knowledge was remarkably accurate by modern standards. Turmeric, used extensively in Indian medicine for various inflammatory conditions, has been confirmed by modern research to have genuine anti-inflammatory properties. Neem, used to treat skin conditions and as an antiseptic, has antibacterial and antifungal properties. Black pepper, used to enhance absorption of other medicines, does indeed increase bioavailability of various compounds. Of course, not all traditional medical knowledge was equally accurate. Many treatments were based on theories that modern science doesn't support, and some were likely ineffective or even harmful. But the broader point is that Indian physicians were engaged in systematic observation and treatment, developing a medical system that represented genuine accumulated knowledge about health and disease, not mere superstition or random trial and error. But there's another layer to consider about Gupta period medicine. Medical knowledge was closely tied to spiritual and philosophical understanding. The same texts that described surgical techniques also discussed meditation, moral conduct, and spiritual development as aspects of health. Health wasn't just physical, but encompassed mental and spiritual well-being, requiring attention to diet and lifestyle, to social relationships and ethical behavior, to the patient's entire life context. This holistic approach had both benefits and limitations. On one hand, it recognized that health involves more than just treating physical symptoms, that psychological and social factors matter for well-being. On the other hand, it sometimes led to treating illnesses through spiritual or ritual means when physical interventions might have been more effective. Medical education during the Gupta period was intensive and personal. Students would study with established physicians, learning not just from texts but from direct observation and practice. They would learn to identify medicinal plants, prepare formulations, diagnose conditions, perform procedures. This apprenticeship system ensured that practical knowledge was transmitted alongside theoretical understanding, that students learned the art of medicine as well as the science. Physicians held respected positions in Gupta society. Royal courts employed physicians who attended to the health of rulers and their families. Wealthy families retained physicians. Buddhist monasteries often had medical facilities and resident doctors who treated monks, and sometimes the broader community. Medical care wasn't universally accessible by modern standards, but there was an infrastructure of medical knowledge and practice that served at least parts of the population. The Gupta period's contributions to medicine represented the kind of incremental advancement that characterizes most scientific progress. There weren't dramatic breakthroughs that revolutionized understanding overnight, but rather steady accumulation of knowledge, refinement of techniques, better understanding of how to help sick people heal. This patient advancement, supported by stable institutions and cultural value placed on healing, created a medical tradition that would influence medicine across Asia for centuries to come, leading us to explore how the Gupta period's creative energies manifested in the realm of art and aesthetic achievement. Walk into any major museum with an Asian art collection, and you will likely find sculptures from the Gupta period. They're distinctive, recognizable even to untrained eyes, characterized by a particular grace and serenity that seems to radiate from the stone itself. These sculptures represent one of the Golden Age's most enduring achievements, works of art that communicate across 15 centuries, speaking a visual language of spiritual realization and aesthetic perfection. Gupta sculpture emerged from earlier traditions but refined them into something new. Buddhist sculpture from the earlier Kushan period had been influenced by Greek artistic conventions, creating somewhat realistic but sometimes rigid figures. Gupta sculptors moved toward an idealized human form that suggested the spiritual rather than merely representing the physical. Bodies that were anatomically perfect yet somehow transcendent. Faces that combined human features with serene otherworldliness. Consider the famous standing Buddha from Sarnath, created during the Gupta period. The figure stands in perfect symmetry. Body visible through thin robes that cling to the form like wet cloth, revealing the idealized body beneath. The face is serene, eyes half closed in meditation, lips curved in a subtle smile that suggests inner peace. The hand gesture, or mudra, indicates teaching, connecting the figure to the Buddha's first sermon at Sarnath after his enlightenment. This sculpture wasn't trying to show what the historical Buddha actually looked like. It was showing the Buddha as spiritual ideal, as perfect teacher, as embodiment of enlightenment itself. Every element was carefully considered, from the positioning of the feet to the curve of the fingers, from the arrangement of the robes to the texture of the hair. The result was an image that communicated Buddhist teachings through visual form, that made spiritual concepts tangible and accessible, and this connects to something equally important about Gupta artistic achievement. Sculptors had mastered their materials completely, understood how to make hard stone appear soft and flowing, how to create depth and shadow, how to suggest movement in static form. They could carve details so fine they seem impossible in stone, creating jewellery that appears to be separate from the body, fingers that seem to move, fabric that seems to flow in gentle wind. This technical mastery was put in service of spiritual expression. Hindu sculpture from the Gupta period shows similar characteristics. Images of Vishnu, Shiva, and various other deities combined ideal human beauty with divine attributes, multiple arms suggesting cosmic power, elaborate crowns and jewellery indicating royal status while maintaining the serene composure that suggested transcendent wisdom. Building on this, we can understand how Gupta sculpture influenced art across Asia. As Buddhism spread from India to Central Asia, China, Southeast Asia, and eventually Japan, it carried with it Gupta artistic conventions. The serene Buddha figures of Tang Dynasty China, the graceful bodhisattvas of Japanese Buddhist temples, the stone sculptures of Javanese monuments all show Gupta influence. Adaptations of the visual language developed in India during the Golden Age, but there's a quieter story unfolding in the workshops where these sculptures were created. We don't know the names of most Gupta sculptors. Unlike later European art traditions where individual artists were celebrated and their biographies preserved, Indian sculpture was often anonymous, created by craftspeople whose work was valuable, but whose individual identities weren't recorded. This doesn't mean the work was impersonal or mechanical, but rather that artistic creation was understood differently, as service to divine or spiritual purposes rather than as individual expression. Sculptors worked in workshops, often as part of larger temple construction projects. They would carve not just the main images but also the countless smaller figures, decorative elements, narrative panels that covered temple walls. These workshop traditions transmitted techniques and conventions from master to apprentice, maintaining artistic continuity across generations while allowing for individual variation and innovation within established forms. The materials varied by region and availability. Sandstone from Mathura and Chunar was favoured for its workability and durability, taking fine detail and weathering well over centuries. In some regions, bronze casting produced beautiful sculptures through the lost wax process, creating images of remarkable delicacy and detail. In others, terracotta figurines brought artistic sophistication to more accessible media. What we're left with is a body of work that reveals the Gupta period's aesthetic values, its spiritual preoccupations, its technical capabilities. These sculptures weren't meant primarily as art in the modern sense, objects to be contemplated for their aesthetic qualities alone. They were religious images, objects of devotion, teaching tools that communicated complex philosophical and theological concepts through visual form. But they were also beautiful, created with such skill and sensitivity that they communicate even to viewers who don't share the religious beliefs they were meant to serve, creating bridges across time and culture through their serene beauty and careful craftsmanship, as we drift toward considering how this same period expressed its creative genius in the realm of literature and drama. If we had to choose a single figure to represent the literary achievement of the Gupta Golden Age, it would be Kalidasa, the poet and dramatist whose works represent the pinnacle of classical Sanskrit literature. We know almost nothing about Kalidasa's life, the biographical details lost to time, leaving only the works themselves as evidence of his genius. But what works they are, poems and plays of such beauty and sophistication that they've been admired, translated and studied for 1500 years. Kalidasa's most famous play, Abhijnana Shakuntalam, tells the story of King Dushyanta, who falls in love with Shakuntala, a hermit's daughter living in a forest ashram. They marry, but a curse causes the king to forget her, until a ring she carries reminds him of their love. The plot might sound simple, but Kalidasa's treatment transforms it into something extraordinary, a meditation on love and memory, duty and desire, nature and civilization. The play opens with one of the most celebrated verses in Sanskrit literature, a benediction that sets the tone for everything that follows. It invokes the 8 manifestations of Shiva, from earth to the celestial realm, using language that is both deeply meaningful and musically beautiful. This wasn't just decoration, but demonstrated the interconnection of all aspects of existence, the cosmic framework within which the human drama would unfold. What makes Kalidasa's writing remarkable is its combination of emotional depth with linguistic beauty. Sanskrit is a highly inflected language capable of great precision and musicality, and Kalidasa exploited these qualities masterfully. His verses could be read for their literal meaning, but also contained layers of suggestion and resonance, playing with sounds and meanings, creating beauty at multiple levels simultaneously. which helps explain why translating Kalidasa is so difficult. The plays and poems work in Sanskrit in ways that don't transfer easily to other languages, relying on the specific qualities of Sanskrit phonology and grammar, on cultural references that require extensive explanation, on aesthetic principles that are specific to Indian literary traditions. Yet something of their power survives even in translation, testament to the underlying genius of the compositions. This, in turn, leads us to understand the broader literary culture of the Gupta period. Kalidasa wasn't working in isolation, but within a sophisticated tradition of Sanskrit literature that had developed over centuries. There were established conventions for different poetic forms, elaborate theories of aesthetics and meaning, expected knowledge that audiences would bring to performances and readings. The concept of rasa, roughly translated as aesthetic flavour or emotional essence, was central to Indian aesthetic theory. A successful literary work should evoke particular rasas in the audience, emotional states ranging from romantic love to heroism, from compassion to wonder. Kalidasa's works were masterful at evoking rasas, taking audiences through carefully orchestrated emotional journeys that satisfied sophisticated aesthetic expectations. His poem, Meghaduta, the Cloud Messenger, demonstrates different aspects of his talent. It tells the story of a yaksha, a divine being exiled to a distant mountain, who asks a cloud to carry a message of love to his wife. The poem describes the cloud's journey across India from south to north, providing occasion for beautiful descriptions of landscapes, cities, rivers, mountains, each lovingly detailed, each adding to the emotional effect of longing and separation. But there's another dimension to this poem worth exploring. Through the yaksha's message, Kalidasa created a geography of emotion, mapping love and longing onto the physical landscape of India. The poem celebrates Indian geography while exploring universal human emotions, creates beauty through description while building emotional intensity, demonstrates technical mastery while appearing effortless and natural. Kalidasa's works were performed at court, studied by students of literature, admired by scholars and poets who came after him. They set standards for Sanskrit literary achievement, providing models that later writers would emulate and try to equal. The very existence of such sophisticated literature required a supporting cultural infrastructure, royal patronage that supported poets, audiences capable of appreciating complex literary works, schools where the language and literary traditions were taught and maintained. The Gupta period provided this infrastructure, creating conditions where literary art could flourish. Kings like Chandragupta II gathered poets and scholars at their courts, provided patronage that allowed them to devote time to creative work, appreciated and rewarded literary excellence. This wasn't merely personal vanity, but reflected cultural values that placed high worth on artistic achievement, on language used beautifully, on the creation of works that would endure beyond the immediate moment. And perhaps this is what matters most about the literary achievements of the Gupta Golden Age. They demonstrate a civilization operating at the height of its cultural powers, creating works of lasting beauty and significance, valuing the intangible but profoundly human endeavour of making meaning through language, as we continue our journey into the other arts that flourished in this remarkable period. The Gupta period witnessed crucial developments in temple architecture, transforming the ways Indians created sacred spaces and establishing architectural forms that would influence temple building for centuries to come. Before the Gupta era, monumental religious architecture in India had largely focused on Buddhist stupas and rock-cut caves. The Guptas helped establish the freestanding stone temple as the characteristic form of Hindu sacred architecture. Early Gupta temples were relatively simple structures, but they established important principles. The temple was conceived as the dwelling place of the deity, with the central shrine called the Garbhagriha, the womb chamber, housing the main image. This inner sanctum was dark, intimate, creating a profound sense of entering sacred space separate from the ordinary world outside. Worshippers would approach through progressively more sacred spaces, moving from the mundane to the divine. One of the best preserved examples from this period is the Dashavatara temple at Deogar, built in the early 6th century. It stands on a high platform with stairs leading up to the entrance, already suggesting the temple as a mountain, as axis mundi connecting earth and heaven. The walls are adorned with carved panels showing scenes from Hindu mythology, Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent, narratives that instructed worshippers while decorating the sacred space. The temple's design shows careful attention to proportion and symmetry, creating a sense of harmony and order that reflected cosmic principles. The square plan, oriented to the cardinal directions, suggested the temple as a microcosm, a perfect world in miniature where divine principles were manifested in stone and space. This wasn't merely aesthetic preference, but reflected deep philosophical and religious understanding of how sacred architecture should function. And this brings us to something equally remarkable about temple construction during this period. Building a temple was an act of devotion, often funded by royal patronage, but also by wealthy merchants and communities pooling resources. The construction itself was understood as religiously meritorious, following prescribed rituals and measurements from sacred texts called the Vastu Shastra and Shilpa Shastra that governed architecture and sculpture. The builders and craftspeople who created these temples were following divine blueprints, literally understood as reproducing sacred forms revealed in texts and tradition. The dimensions weren't arbitrary but followed cosmic proportions, relating parts to whole in ratios that reflected universal principles. The orientation aligned the temple with celestial directions, connecting earthly worship with cosmic order. Which leads us naturally to consider the sculptural programs that adorn these temples. The walls weren't left blank but covered with carved images, narratives, decorative elements that transformed stone into visual scripture. These carvings served multiple purposes. They beautified the sacred space, they instructed worshippers in religious stories and principles, they demonstrated the patron's devotion and wealth, they provided work for skilled craftspeople whose labour was itself a form of worship. The iconography was complex and meaningful, each deity depicted according to established conventions, with specific attributes, gestures, associated figures that communicated identity and significance. Vishnu held his discus and conch, Shiva carried his trident and drum, goddesses bore their characteristic weapons and symbols. For the educated worshipper, these images were readable texts, communicating theological concepts through visual form. But there's a quieter story unfolding in the regional variations that were emerging. While Gupta temples established certain basic forms and principles, different regions developed their own stylistic variations, their own preferences for decorative elements and structural features. The temples of northern India would develop into the Nagara style with its distinctive tower, while southern India would eventually evolve the Dravida style with its pyramidal towers. The Gupta period was establishing the foundations from which these regional traditions would grow. Temple building wasn't just about creating places of worship, but about demonstrating and reinforcing social and cosmic order. The temple stood at the centre of its community, physically and symbolically, representing the properly ordered universe with the divine at its centre. Processions and festivals organised around the temple created rhythms of community life, brought people together in shared ritual, enacted the relationships between humans and gods, between rulers and subjects, between different castes and social groups. What remains from the Gupta period is fragmentary, many temples damaged or destroyed by later conquest and conversion, by simple weathering and neglect. But what survives is enough to show the beginnings of a tradition that would produce some of the world's most magnificent sacred architecture, the great temple complexes of Khajuraho, Konark, Madurai, and countless others. The Gupta period established the grammar of Indian temple architecture, created the vocabulary of forms that would be elaborated and varied but never entirely abandoned, as we move gently towards considering how this same period saw Buddhist architecture reach new heights of expression in cave temples carved from living rock. In a remote horseshoe-shaped ravine in the Deccan Plateau, a series of caves were carved from the basalt rock, their dark interiors covered with some of the finest paintings to survive from ancient India. The Ajanta caves, worked on intermittently from the 2nd century before the Common Era through the Gupta period, reached their artistic zenith during the 5th and 6th centuries, when Gupta period patronage funded elaborate expansions and the creation of the magnificent paintings for which they are now famous. These weren't natural caves, but rock-cut architecture, monasteries and worship halls carved entirely from solid stone. The labour required was enormous. Teams of workers cutting away tons of rock to create the cave interiors, then sculptors carving pillars and facades, then artists preparing surfaces and applying the remarkable paintings that covered walls and ceilings. The entire complex represents decades of sustained effort, considerable financial resources, deep devotion to Buddhism that motivated such extraordinary projects. The paintings at Ajanta are technically remarkable. The artists prepared the rock surfaces with layers of clay and other materials, creating smooth surfaces that would accept paint. They worked with natural pigments, mineral and vegetable colours that have survived 15 centuries in the dark cave interiors. The technique involved careful planning, sketching outlines, building up colours in layers, adding details and highlights, creating images of remarkable delicacy and sophistication. Imagine, if you will, standing in one of these cave shrines lit by oil lamps that would have been the only illumination, watching the painted walls emerge from darkness. The images show scenes from the Buddha's life and from the Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous births. They show palace scenes and forest hermitages, royal courts and merchant caravans, capturing the full spectrum of Indian life during the Gupta period while telling religious narratives. The artists who created these paintings understood human form and movement, could depict bodies in complex poses, showed subtle expressions and gestures. They understood perspective and composition, creating scenes with depth and movement despite working in 2 dimensions. The paintings show processions and celebrations, moments of devotion and meditation, dramatic events and quiet scenes, all rendered with grace and attention to detail. But there's another layer to consider about these images. They weren't meant primarily as art to be admired for aesthetic qualities, but as teaching tools and objects of devotion. The Jataka tales showed the Buddha perfecting virtues over many lifetimes, providing moral examples and instruction in Buddhist principles. The scenes from the Buddha's life reminded viewers of key events and teachings, made abstract doctrines concrete and accessible through narrative and image. Yet the paintings are undeniably beautiful, created with such skill and sensitivity that they work as art even for viewers who don't know the stories being depicted or share the religious beliefs they were meant to serve. The artists clearly took pleasure in their work, delighted in rendering fine details, showed pride in their technical abilities. Some caves include painted decorative patterns of remarkable intricacy, geometric designs and floral motifs that demonstrate pure aesthetic enjoyment in creating beautiful things. Building on this foundation, we can understand how Ajanta fits into the broader pattern of Buddhist patronage during the Gupta period. While the Gupta emperors were Hindu by personal belief, they supported Buddhist institutions generously. The Vakataka dynasty, which ruled the Deccan and was allied with the Guptas, provided particular patronage to Ajanta, funding the expansion and decoration of several caves. This patronage reflected both personal devotion and political calculation. Supporting religious institutions demonstrated piety and earned religious merit. It also created lasting monuments that proclaimed the patron's wealth and taste, provided employment for craftspeople and workers, strengthened relationships with religious communities that held considerable social influence. The caves at Ajanta advertise Vakataka power and piety, while serving genuine religious purposes. The monastery caves provided living quarters for Buddhist monks, with individual cells opening onto a central hall, veranda areas for meditation and study, cisterns for water storage. These were working monasteries, not just artistic showpieces, housing communities of monks who studied and practiced Buddhism, taught students, provided spiritual services to nearby communities. The worship halls, called Chaitya halls, followed a specific architectural plan with a long hall leading to a stupa at the rear, with columns dividing side aisles from the central nave, all carved from solid rock. These spaces were designed for ritual circumambulation. Walking around the stupa while chanting and praying, a practice that remains central to Buddhist worship. Let that thought settle as we move forward. The caves at Ajanta weren't created quickly or casually, but represented sustained commitment across generations, communities dedicating enormous resources to creating sacred spaces of lasting beauty and religious significance. The paintings and sculptures that fill these caves emerge from a culture that valued religious art highly enough to support it lavishly, that understood beauty as an appropriate offering to the sacred, that believed the effort of creating such spaces was itself spiritually meaningful and meritorious, leading us to consider how religious devotion manifested in the even more intimate forms of personal worship and practice. During the Gupta period, a transformative shift was occurring in Indian religious life that would profoundly shape Hinduism for centuries to come. The Bhakti movement, emphasizing personal devotion to a chosen deity over formal ritual and abstract philosophy, was beginning to flower, offering a more accessible and emotionally satisfying religious path that would eventually spread throughout India and transform Hindu practice. Bhakti, from the Sanskrit root meaning to share or participate, emphasized loving devotion to God conceived as a personal deity. Rather than the elaborate sacrificial rituals of Vedic religion or the complex philosophical systems of various schools of thought, Bhakti offered a direct relationship with the divine through love, surrender, worship, and often ecstatic emotional connection. This path was theoretically open to all regardless of caste or education, requiring only sincere devotion rather than ritual knowledge or philosophical sophistication. The Gupta period saw this movement gaining momentum, particularly in devotion to Vishnu and Shiva, though it would eventually encompass devotion to various forms of the goddess and other deities. The Bhagavad Gita, composed earlier but gaining prominence during this period, taught that bhakti was one of the primary paths to liberation, alongside knowledge and ritual action, giving scriptural authority to devotional practice, which helps explain why bhakti proves so appealing and enduring. For ordinary people without access to extensive education or priestly knowledge, the elaborate rituals and complex philosophies of traditional Hinduism could seem distant and inaccessible. Bhakti offered something more immediate and personal, a relationship with God based on love and devotion that didn't require intermediaries or special knowledge. You could be illiterate and poor yet a great devotee, your devotion valued more highly than ritual correctness or philosophical understanding. This, in turn, leads us to understand how bhakti manifested in practice. Devotees would sing hymns to their chosen deity. Expressions of love and longing that often use the imagery of human relationships, lover and beloved, parent and child, master and servant, to describe the soul's relationship with God. These weren't abstract theological statements, but intensely emotional expressions of devotion, often in vernacular languages rather than Sanskrit, making them accessible to people who couldn't read classical texts. The worship practices associated with bhakti emphasized puja, devotional ritual that involved offering flowers, incense, food, and prayers to images of the deity. This was worship that individuals could perform in their homes as well as in temples, creating personal relationships with the divine that complemented but didn't require mediation by priests or elaborate temple rituals. The image of the deity wasn't just a symbol, but was understood as a real manifestation of divine presence, deserving of and receiving loving care and attention. But there's another dimension to bhakti worth exploring. While it offered a more egalitarian religious path in theory, in practice it still operated within the hierarchical structure of Indian society. Saints and religious teachers emerged who were celebrated for their devotion, but social hierarchies persisted, and the highest positions of religious authority remained largely restricted to upper caste males. Even within movements that theoretically valued devotion over birth, Yet Bhakti did create some space for religious expression from groups typically excluded from religious authority. Women saints emerged, their devotional poetry preserved and celebrated, offering female perspectives on divine love and spiritual seeking. Lower caste devotees were sometimes recognized as saints based on their devotion rather than dismissed because of their birth. These were limited openings. Constrained by persistent social hierarchies, but they were meaningful for those who found in Bhakti a validation of their spiritual worth despite social subordination. The stories of great devotees became part of Hindu tradition, narratives that modelled ideal devotion and showed how various types of people from different backgrounds achieved spiritual realization through Bhakti. These stories served multiple purposes. They taught devotional practices and attitudes. They demonstrated that devotion transcended social boundaries. They provided inspiration and models for ordinary practitioners. They created a hagiography, a collection of saints' lives that paralleled similar collections in other religious traditions. During the Gupta period, temples dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva were being built across northern India, providing focal points for devotional practice. The images installed in these temples, the beautiful sculptures we discussed earlier, were objects of devotion, receiving daily worship, carried in processions during festivals, treated as royal presences residing among their devotees. The temples organized community life around worship, created rhythms of daily ritual and annual festivals that brought people together in shared devotion. What we're left with is a religious movement that would profoundly shape Indian culture, that offered a more personal and accessible religious path while working within and sometimes challenging existing social structures. The Bhakti movement during the Gupta period was still in its early phases, but it was establishing patterns and practices that would continue evolving, eventually producing some of Hinduism's greatest poetry and music, most beloved saints and teachers. Most widespread and enduring forms of practice, as we drift toward considering how philosophy and intellectual inquiry were simultaneously flourishing in this remarkably creative period. While Bhakti offered devotion and temples provided worship spaces, Indian philosophical traditions during the Gupta period were engaged in sophisticated intellectual debates about the nature of reality, consciousness, liberation, and the path to ultimate truth. Multiple schools of philosophy coexisted, debated with each other, developed increasingly refined arguments and counter-arguments in a remarkable display of intellectual vitality. The 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy, the Astika darshanas that accepted the authority of the Vedas, each developed distinctive positions on fundamental questions. Samkhya proposed a dualistic philosophy distinguishing Purusha, pure consciousness, from Prakriti, nature or matter. Yoga, closely related to Samkhya, emphasized meditative practices for achieving union with the divine. Nyaya developed rigorous logical methods for analyzing arguments and establishing valid knowledge. Vaisheshika proposed an atomistic philosophy, understanding reality as composed of eternal atoms combining in various ways. Mimamsa focused on proper interpretation of Vedic texts and correct performance of ritual. And Vedanta, which would eventually become the most influential, explored the relationship between individual self and ultimate reality, based on the teachings of the Upanishads, developing positions ranging from complete non-dualism to qualified dualism. These weren't just abstract speculations, but serious intellectual attempts to understand fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and meaning. Philosophers developed sophisticated arguments, anticipated objections, refined their positions through debate and writing. The philosophical texts from this period show rigorous thinking, careful definition of terms, systematic exploration of positions and their implications. And this connects to something equally important about how philosophy functioned in Indian intellectual culture. Philosophical debate wasn't primarily about winning arguments, but about pursuing truth, understanding reality more clearly, finding paths to liberation from suffering. The different schools could coexist because they were understood as different perspectives on ultimate reality, different paths up the same mountain, each with insights and limitations. The Buddhist philosophical traditions were equally sophisticated, developing positions that challenged Hindu assumptions while engaging with similar fundamental questions. The Madhyamaka school, founded by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century but flourishing during the Gupta period, argued that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, that concepts themselves are ultimately empty, leading to a radical philosophical position that nevertheless claimed to point toward liberating truth. The Yogacara school proposed a form of idealism, understanding mind or consciousness as the fundamental reality, with the apparent external world being projections of consciousness rather than independent reality. These weren't idle speculations, but philosophical positions developed through careful argument, defended against objections, explored in their implications for practice and liberation. Building on this foundation, we can understand how philosophical debate was institutionalized in centers like Nalanda. Scholars from different schools would debate, presenting their positions and defending them against challenges, developing reputations based on their argumentative skill and philosophical insight. These debates followed established rules, using recognized logical forms, appealing to accepted texts and authorities, while also developing new arguments and positions. The debates weren't purely intellectual exercises, but had religious and social significance. A successful philosopher could attract students and patronage, could influence religious practice and belief, could contribute to their school's prestige and influence. Kings and wealthy patrons supported philosophers and philosophical schools, provided resources for study and debate, attended and sometimes participated in philosophical discussions. But there's a quieter story unfolding alongside these debates. Philosophy wasn't separate from practical concerns about how to live, how to achieve happiness or liberation, how to understand one's place in the cosmos. The philosophical schools generally understood themselves as offering paths to liberation, practical methods grounded in theoretical understanding of reality. Philosophy led to practice, which led to experience, which informed further philosophical reflection. The relationship between philosophy and religion in India was complex and fluid. Philosophical schools were associated with religious traditions but also maintained some independence, pursuing rational inquiry wherever it led. A philosopher might be a devout Hindu or Buddhist, while still questioning traditional beliefs, developing positions that challenged established religious views. This created tensions but also productive intellectual ferment. The Gupta period's philosophical achievements represented the kind of intellectual sophistication that emerges when inquiry is supported institutionally and culturally, when scholars have time and resources for sustained thought, when debate is valued and encouraged. The arguments developed during this period would continue influencing Indian philosophy for centuries, would be studied and debated, accepted and challenged, providing a living tradition of philosophical inquiry that persists to the present day. And perhaps this is what matters most about the philosophical traditions of the Gupta Golden Age. They demonstrate a civilization committed to rational inquiry, willing to question fundamental assumptions, capable of sustaining sophisticated intellectual debate across generations. They show that ancient India wasn't merely preserving tradition, but actively thinking, questioning, developing new ideas and arguments, engaging in the kind of open intellectual inquiry that represents one of humanity's highest achievements, leading us to consider how this same period saw developments in astronomy that combined philosophical inquiry with careful observation and mathematical sophistication. Indian astronomy during the Gupta period represented a remarkable synthesis of observation, mathematics, and cosmological speculation, producing sophisticated models of celestial mechanics and remarkably accurate astronomical calculations. Astronomers weren't just observing the sky, but trying to understand the cosmos, developing theories that would explain planetary motions, predict eclipses, calculate the length of days and years, all while working within cosmological frameworks that understood the universe as both physical and spiritual reality. We've already mentioned Aryabhatta, whose Aryabhatiya compiled in 499 represented the culmination of Gupta period astronomical achievement. But Aryabhata worked within a tradition, building on earlier observations and theories while making his own original contributions. Indian astronomy had been developing for centuries, accumulating observations, refining techniques, creating increasingly sophisticated mathematical models. The primary motivation for astronomical study was practical and religious. Accurate calendars were essential for determining the proper times for religious rituals and festivals, which were tied to specific astronomical events and planetary positions. Astrology, which used astronomical knowledge to make predictions about human affairs, was deeply integrated into Indian culture. Consulted for determining auspicious times for important events, for understanding character and destiny, for advising rulers on political decisions. But astronomy went beyond these practical applications to genuine scientific inquiry. Indian astronomers observed the heavens carefully, tracked planetary movements, recorded eclipses, noticed phenomena that required explanation. They developed geometric models that could predict astronomical events with remarkable accuracy, using mathematics to describe celestial mechanics in ways that worked even when the underlying cosmology wasn't entirely accurate by modern standards. Which helps explain why Aryabhata's work was so significant. He proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, a remarkably accurate insight that explained the apparent daily movement of the stars without requiring the entire celestial sphere to rotate. He understood that the moon and planets shine by reflected sunlight rather than their own light, another accurate observation that required careful thinking about what was actually being observed. His calculation of the length of the solar year, 365.3586 days, was accurate to within minutes of the modern value, an extraordinary achievement given the observational and mathematical tools available. He provided methods for calculating the positions of planets, for predicting eclipses, for solving various astronomical problems, methods that were both mathematically sophisticated and practically useful. This, in turn, leads us to understand the institutional context that supported this astronomy. Royal patronage funded astronomical observations and calculations, supported scholars who could devote time to studying the heavens, valued astronomical knowledge for both practical and prestige purposes. Astronomical texts were studied, copied, transmitted, becoming part of the educational curriculum at centres of learning. The cosmological frameworks within which Indian astronomers worked combined what we would consider scientific observation with mythological and spiritual elements. The universe was understood as cyclical, going through vast periods of creation and dissolution, with timescales that were enormous by any standard. Within this cosmic dance, the planets moved according to divine plans, but also according to mathematical laws that could be discovered and expressed. Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain, stood at the centre of the universe in these cosmologies, with continents arranged around it, with celestial bodies moving in patterns that were both spiritually significant and mathematically describable. The sun and moon and planets weren't just physical objects, but also divine beings, their movements reflecting both natural law and divine will. But there's another dimension to consider about how this cosmology functioned. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss it as simply wrong, as primitive science that missed the heliocentric reality. But within its own framework, it worked. The mathematical models based on this cosmology could make accurate predictions, could calculate eclipses and planetary positions with impressive precision. The cosmology provided meaning and context for astronomical phenomena, integrated them into a broader understanding of cosmic order. What remains from Gupta period astronomy is a tradition of careful observation, combined with mathematical sophistication, of practical calculation serving both religious and secular purposes, of inquiry into the nature of the cosmos that produced genuine insights, despite operating within a cosmological framework we now understand differently. The astronomical texts from this period would be studied for centuries. would influence astronomical traditions in the Islamic world and beyond, would contribute to humanity's growing understanding of the heavens. Let's rest here for a moment with this thought. Looking up at the night sky, Indian astronomers of the Gupta period saw the same stars we see today, noticed the same planetary motions, observed the same eclipses and comets. But they understood what they saw within different frameworks, asked different questions, sought different kinds of explanations. Their achievements remind us that understanding is always situated within particular cultural and intellectual contexts, that scientific progress isn't linear but involves false starts and alternative paths, that even theories we now consider incorrect can generate real knowledge and practical success as we continue our journey into the later phases of the Gupta Empire and the challenges it would face. The Gupta Empire didn't exist in isolation, but was connected through trade and cultural exchange with civilizations across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The maritime trade routes linking India with Southeast Asia, China, the Roman Empire, and East Africa brought not just goods but also ideas, technologies, and people, creating a cosmopolitan world where cultures influenced each other in complex and fascinating ways. Indian merchants had been trading with distant lands for centuries before the Gupta period, but the Golden Age saw this trade flourish to new levels. The conquest of Western India by Chandragupta II gave the Guptas control of important ports like Broach and Cambay, gateways to maritime trade with the West. Through these ports flowed Indian textiles, spices, precious stones, ivory, and exotic animals traded for Roman gold coins, wine, glassware, and other luxury goods. The Roman demand for Indian goods was enormous, creating trade imbalances that worried Roman writers who complained about gold flowing out of the empire to pay for Eastern luxuries. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, estimated that India drained 50 million sesterces from Rome annually, a vast sum that testified to how highly Roman elites valued Indian products. This trade continued through the Gupta period, connecting Indian prosperity with Mediterranean demand. Imagine, if you will, the journey of a merchant ship from the ports of Western India to the Red Sea. The ship would be loaded with cotton textiles, particularly the fine muslins that were highly prized in Rome, with pepper and other spices, with precious stones from Ceylon, with ivory from Indian elephants, with peacocks and parrots as exotic pets for wealthy Romans. The voyage would take advantage of the monsoon winds, sailing west during the summer monsoon, returning east during the winter. The journey was dangerous. Ships could be lost to storms, attacked by pirates, run aground on unfamiliar coasts. But the potential profits were enormous, enough to justify the risks, to support a network of merchants and sailors, middlemen and agents who facilitated this long-distance trade. Some merchants made fortunes, became wealthy enough to rival nobility, patronized religious institutions and public works, formed guilds that wielded significant economic and political power. Building on this foundation, we can understand the even more extensive trade connections with Southeast Asia. Indian merchants and settlers had been establishing communities in what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam for centuries, bringing Hindu and Buddhist religions, Sanskrit culture, Indian artistic and architectural traditions. The Gupta period saw this cultural influence reach new heights. The Indianization of Southeast Asia, as scholars sometimes call it, wasn't conquest or colonization in the political sense, but rather cultural transmission through trade and migration. Local rulers adopted Sanskrit titles and Hindu or Buddhist religions, commissioned temples built in Indian styles, patronized Sanskrit literature, employed Brahmin priests and Buddhist monks. But they adapted these borrowings to local conditions, creating hybrid cultures that were genuinely Southeast Asian rather than merely imitations of Indian civilization. The famous temples of Angkor in Cambodia, built centuries after the Gupta period, show this process clearly. They're built in styles influenced by Indian architecture, decorated with scenes from Hindu epics, dedicated to Hindu deities, yet they're distinctly Khmer, incorporating local artistic traditions and serving local political and religious purposes. The Indianization was real but also selective and adaptive. Trade with China was more indirect, generally conducted through Central Asian intermediaries along the Silk Road, but it existed and created connections between Indian and Chinese civilizations. Chinese pilgrims came to India seeking Buddhist texts and teachings. Chinese goods reached Indian markets. Indian products found their way to China. The connections weren't as extensive as those with Southeast Asia or the Mediterranean, but they were real and consequential. But there's a quieter story unfolding in the smaller scale trade that was equally important economically, even if less dramatic. Coastal trade around the Indian Ocean connected Indian ports with East African ports, with Arabia, with the Persian Gulf. Overland trade routes linked India with Central Asia, with the Iranian plateau, eventually with China. This created a vast commercial network where goods and people moved constantly, where merchant communities became cosmopolitan and multilingual, where ideas and technologies spread along with material goods. The economic effects of this trade were significant. The revenue from trade taxes supported Gupta administration and military, funded the patronage of arts and learning, allowed for the kind of prosperity that made the Golden Age possible. The cosmopolitan exposure to foreign goods and ideas stimulated innovation, introduced new technologies and artistic styles, enriched Indian culture through contact with other civilizations. What we're left with is an understanding of the Gupta Empire as part of a wider world, connected through trade and cultural exchange with civilizations across a vast area from Western Europe to China, from Central Asia to East Africa. The golden age of Indian civilization wasn't created in isolation, but emerged from and contributed to this broader pattern of exchange and interaction. This early version of globalization that predated modern telecommunications and rapid transport, but nonetheless created genuine connections across vast distances, leading us to consider how religion itself moved along these trade routes and transformed as it travelled. One of the most significant developments facilitated by trade routes and cultural contacts was the spread of Buddhism from India to Central Asia, China, Korea, and eventually Japan, transforming from an Indian religion into a Pan-Asian tradition that would shape civilizations far beyond its birthplace. The Gupta period was crucial to this process, providing the cultural and intellectual achievements that made Indian Buddhism attractive to foreign seekers, while seeing the beginning of Buddhism's decline in India itself. Buddhism had been spreading along trade routes for centuries before the Gupta period. Merchants and monks carried Buddhist texts and teachings to Central Asian oasis cities, establishing monasteries that became centers of learning and way station for travelers from Central Asia. Buddhism entered China, where it would undergo profound transformations as it adapted to Chinese cultural contexts. The appeal of Buddhism to Chinese was complex. Chinese civilization had sophisticated indigenous philosophical and religious traditions, Confucianism and Taoism particularly, that addressed many of the same concerns Buddhism addressed. But Buddhism offered something different, a focus on individual spiritual liberation, sophisticated philosophical systems, elaborate mythologies and cosmologies, monastic traditions that provided alternatives to traditional Chinese social structures, which leads us naturally to consider how Buddhism changed as it adapted to Chinese culture. The Chinese language and conceptual framework were profoundly different from Sanskrit and Indian thought. Translating Buddhist texts into Chinese required not just linguistic skill, but creative adaptation, finding Chinese terms for Indian concepts, sometimes creating new vocabulary, sometimes repurposing Taoist terms to express Buddhist ideas even when the fit wasn't perfect. The Chinese reception of Buddhism wasn't passive acceptance, but active interpretation and transformation. Chinese Buddhists developed new schools of thought that emphasized teachings particularly resonant with Chinese culture. Chan Buddhism, which would become Zen in Japan, developed from Indian meditation practices but took on distinctively Chinese characteristics, emphasizing sudden enlightenment and paradoxical teachings. Influenced by Taoist ideas even while remaining fundamentally Buddhist. This, in turn, leads us to understand the role of Chinese pilgrims who travelled to India seeking authentic Buddhist teachings. The most famous was Faxian, who visited India in the early 5th century, and later Xuanzang, who spent years at Nalanda in the 7th century. These pilgrims endured dangerous journeys across mountains and deserts to reach the Buddhist Holy Land, to visit sites associated with the Buddha's life, to study with Indian masters, to obtain Sanskrit texts they could translate. Their travel accounts provide valuable historical information about India during and shortly after the Gupta period. Faxian described a prosperous, well-governed empire where Buddhism flourished alongside Hinduism, where people travelled freely and safely, where Buddhist institutions were wealthy and well supported. His account, while not entirely objective, provides an outsider's perspective on Gupta civilization at its height. But there's another layer to consider about Buddhism during the Gupta period itself. While Buddhism was spreading successfully abroad, it was beginning a long, slow decline in India. The Gupta emperors, though tolerant and sometimes supportive of Buddhism, were personally Hindu, worshipping Vishnu primarily. Their patronage increasingly favoured Hindu institutions, funded Hindu temples, supported Hindu scholars and teachers. This shift in patronage reflected and accelerated broader social trends. The Bhakti movement was making Hinduism more accessible and emotionally satisfying, competing successfully with Buddhism for popular devotion. Hindu philosophy was engaging with and sometimes incorporating Buddhist insights while developing distinctively Hindu positions. The institutional advantages Buddhism had enjoyed, particularly monastic institutions with landholdings and royal support, were gradually being matched by Hindu institutions. The process was gradual, taking centuries, and Buddhism would remain significant in parts of India long after the Gupta period. But the trend was clear. Buddhism's future lay outside India, in the lands to which it had successfully spread, where it would continue evolving and flourishing. In its birthplace, it would eventually become a minority tradition, its insights absorbed into Hinduism, its institutions fading or being replaced. The irony is profound. Indian Buddhism produced some of its greatest intellectual achievements during the Gupta period, and immediately after, the philosophical sophistication of Nagarjuna and later thinkers, the artistic excellence of Ajanta and Gupta sculpture. But these achievements were occurring as Buddhism was beginning its long decline in India, flourishing intellectually and artistically, even as its social and institutional foundations were gradually eroding. What remains is the complex reality of religious change and transmission. Buddhism succeeded brilliantly in adapting to foreign cultures, became truly international, transformed East Asian civilizations while being transformed by them. But in doing so, it gradually lost its connection to its Indian roots, became less distinctively Indian and more universally Asian. The Gupta period saw both the full flowering of Indian Buddhist culture and the beginning of its eventual disappearance from the Indian landscape, a paradox that reminds us that cultural transmission is never simple, that success in one context can coincide with decline in another. As we drift toward considering the empire's own eventual decline and the forces that brought it about. In the northwestern frontiers of the Gupta Empire, in the mountain passes connecting Central Asia with the Indian plains, a storm was gathering that would eventually contribute to the empire's decline. The Hunas, sometimes called White Huns or Hephthalites, were nomadic people from Central Asia who, in the late 5th century, began pressing on India's borders, testing Gupta defences, eventually launching invasions that would devastate parts of northern India and accelerate imperial fragmentation. The Hunas were part of broader movements of nomadic peoples across Central Asia during this period, migrations and invasions that affected civilizations from China to Europe. The same forces that pushed Germanic peoples into the Roman Empire were operating on the Central Asian steppes, where climate changes, resource competition, and the collapse of previous nomadic confederations sent peoples looking for new lands and opportunities. For the Gupta Empire, these northwestern invasions represented a challenge different from the regional kingdoms they had dealt with earlier. The Hunas weren't seeking incorporation into the Indian political system, but rather plunder and conquest, bringing different military tactics and organizational structures, showing little interest in the cultural and religious traditions that had helped integrate earlier invaders into Indian civilization. The first major Huna invasion occurred during the reign of Chandragupta, grandson of Chandragupta II, who took the throne around 455. Chandragupta successfully repelled this invasion, an achievement commemorated in inscriptions that praises valour and military skill. But the cost was high, requiring the mobilization of imperial resources, disrupting trade and agriculture, beginning the strain on the empire's finances and administrative structures. Which helps explain why this military success didn't restore the empire to its earlier strength, but rather marked the beginning of a long decline. The problem wasn't just the Hunas themselves, but the strain of defending against them. Maintaining large armies required resources, grain and supplies, tax revenues that had to be extracted from an already burdened population. The economic disruption of invasions reduced agricultural productivity, interrupted trade, decreased the revenues available for both defence and the peacetime activities that had made the Golden Age golden. Chandragupta's reign saw the empire at full stretch, still controlling its vast territory, but under increasing pressure, still producing cultural achievements, but without the seemingly effortless brilliance of earlier decades. The coins from his reign show declining gold content, suggesting economic stress, debasement of currency to meet expenses. The inscriptions celebrate military victories but also reveal the constant vigilance required to maintain the empire's frontiers. After Chandragupta's death around 467, the situation deteriorated. His successors faced renewed Huna invasions, internal rebellions, the gradual assertion of independence by regional governors and tributary kings. The empire's territory contracted, with peripheral regions breaking away, the Guptas increasingly becoming regional rulers in the Gangetic heartland rather than all India emperors. By the early 6th century, a Huna king named Toramana established his own kingdom in northwestern India, controlling territories that had been part of the Gupta Empire. His son Mihirakula extended Huna control further, launching destructive campaigns that Chinese pilgrims later described as causing great suffering, destroying Buddhist monasteries, disrupting the peaceful conditions that had prevailed under Gupta rule. But there's another dimension to this story worth exploring. The Huna invasions, while damaging, weren't the sole cause of Gupta decline. Empires don't usually fall from external pressure alone, but from the interaction of external challenges with internal weaknesses. The Guptas were facing succession disputes, regional governors asserting autonomy, economic pressures from maintaining a large empire, the normal entropy that affects all political structures over time. The very success of the Gupta system contributed to its decline. Regional governors who had been appointed to manage distant territories became entrenched locally, developed their own power bases, began acting independently while nominally acknowledging Gupta overlordship. Tributary kings who had once accepted Gupta supremacy saw opportunities to assert full independence as central power weakened. The administrative structures that had integrated diverse regions into an empire became frameworks for fragmentation, once central authority could no longer enforce unity. The cultural achievements of the Golden Age paradoxically contributed to this process. The support for local temples and institutions, the patronage that had spread throughout the empire created centres of power and identity that didn't depend on imperial authority. Religious institutions with their own land holdings and revenues, merchant guilds with economic power, literary and philosophical traditions that were regional as well as imperial, all these created a culturally vibrant India that didn't require a unified empire to flourish. What we're left with is a complex picture of decline, not a dramatic collapse but a gradual fragmentation. the empire slowly dissolving into its constituent parts, while the cultural achievements it had fostered continued and even intensified. The Huna invasions accelerated this process but didn't cause it, serving as the external shock that revealed and exacerbated internal vulnerabilities as we moved gently toward considering what remained after the empire's political unity dissolved. By the middle of the 6th century, the Gupta Empire as a unified political entity had effectively ceased to exist. Later Gupta rulers continued to claim the title and controlled territory around Magadha, the dynastic heartland, but they were regional powers among others, not emperors commanding allegiance across northern India. The golden age of political unity and imperial patronage had ended, replaced by a return to the political fragmentation that had preceded Gupta rule. This fragmentation wasn't collapse into chaos, but rather a new political configuration. Regional kingdoms emerged, some ruled by former Gupta governors or tributary kings, others by new dynasties taking advantage of the power vacuum. The Mokharis in Kannauj, the Maitrikas in Gujarat, the Pushyabhutis in Thanazar, each carved out territories and established their own courts, their own patronage networks, their own claims to legitimate authority. These successor states often maintained and even expanded the cultural achievements of the Gupta period. They built temples, patronized scholars and artists, supported Sanskrit literature and learning. In many ways, the Golden Age continued culturally even as the political unity that had fostered it dissolved. The Gupta period had established patterns and set standards that outlived the empire itself, creating cultural templates that regional kingdoms sought to emulate and continue. Consider the reign of Harsha, who ruled from 606 to 647 and briefly reunified much of northern India under his rule. Harsha wasn't a Gupta, but consciously modelled his kingship on Gupta precedents, gathered scholars and poets at his court, patronised Buddhism extensively, created an administration based on Gupta patterns. His reign demonstrated both how the Gupta model could still inspire successful rule and how difficult sustaining such unity had become. After Harsha's death without an heir, his empire too fragmented, showing the challenge of maintaining unified rule in a politically diverse region without the long-established legitimacy and administrative structures the Guptas had built over generations. The pattern of brief unifications followed by fragmentation would characterize northern Indian politics for centuries, with regional kingdoms the norm and empires the exception. And this brings us to something equally remarkable about cultural continuity despite political fragmentation. Sanskrit as a literary language, the artistic styles developed during the Gupta period, the mathematical and astronomical achievements, the philosophical and religious traditions. All these continued and developed further. The political disunity didn't prevent cultural exchange and development, but rather created multiple centres of patronage and innovation. Regional kingdoms competed not just militarily but culturally, each seeking to demonstrate sophistication and piety through their patronage, creating a decentralised system of cultural support that in some ways exceeded what a single empire could provide. Different regions developed their own distinctive styles in temple architecture, their own schools of sculpture and painting, their own literary traditions in Sanskrit and increasingly in regional languages. The temples built in the centuries after the Gupta period show this clearly. They followed the basic patterns established during the Gupta Golden Age, but developed regional variations that became increasingly distinct. The Nagara style of northern India with its characteristic curved tower, the Dravida style of southern India with its pyramidal tower, the Vasara style that combined elements of both, all emerged from the Gupta architectural foundations but evolved in different directions based on regional preferences and traditions. Building on this, we can understand how the Gupta period's achievements were transmitted to later generations. The texts written during the Golden Age, the Kalidasa plays and Aryabhata's astronomical treatises, the medical and philosophical works, were copied and studied for centuries. Later scholars wrote commentaries explaining and interpreting these texts, creating living traditions of learning that preserved and transmitted Gupta period knowledge. The sculpture and architecture, more vulnerable to destruction and decay, survived less completely. Many Gupta temples were destroyed or fell into ruin, their sculptures damaged or lost. But enough survived to influence later artists and architects, to provide models that could be studied and adapted. And the principles underlying Gupta art, the ideal proportions and serene expressions, the integration of aesthetic and spiritual purposes, these remained influential long after the specific works had disappeared. But there's a quieter story unfolding in the persistence of social and cultural patterns established during the Gupta period. The caste system, codified in legal texts like the Manusmriti that was compiled around this time, continued structuring Indian society for centuries, its hierarchies and restrictions becoming more rigid over time. The patterns of royal patronage for temples and scholars, the close relationship between religious and political authority, the integration of Sanskrit culture with regional traditions, all these persisted. What remains from the Gupta Empire, then, isn't primarily its political structures, which dissolved, but its cultural achievements and the patterns it established. The Golden Age set standards for what Indian civilization could achieve, created achievements that inspired later generations, demonstrated possibilities for art and thought and governance that became part of India's understanding of itself. The empire faded, but its Golden Age entered memory and legend, became a standard against which later achievements were measured. As we continue our journey toward understanding what the Gupta period means for how we think about history and civilization, the concept of a Golden Age is interesting in itself, worth contemplating as we consider what the Gupta period means for our understanding of history. We call certain eras Golden Ages, suggesting they represent peaks of achievement, times when civilizations reach their fullest expression. But what makes an age golden? And what can we learn from recognizing and studying such periods? The Gupta Golden Age was golden primarily in cultural and intellectual terms, rather than in material prosperity alone, though prosperity certainly supported the cultural achievements. What distinguished this period was the remarkable creativity across multiple domains simultaneously: mathematics and literature, art and philosophy, science and religion all flourishing together, each reinforcing and enriching the others. This suggests that golden ages emerge from particular combinations of conditions. Political stability and peace provide the foundation, creating space for pursuits beyond mere survival and security. Economic prosperity provides resources, allows for patronage of scholars and artists who can devote time to their work rather than constant struggle for subsistence. But stability and prosperity alone aren't sufficient, or every peaceful, wealthy society would experience a golden age. What seems equally necessary is a cultural commitment to excellence, a valuing of intellectual and artistic achievement, a willingness to support creative work and serious inquiry, even when it doesn't produce immediate practical benefits. The Gupta emperors and elite understood that a great civilization is measured not just by its wealth and power, but by what it creates, what it contributes to human culture and knowledge that endures beyond the individuals and even the empire itself, which helps explain why some wealthy and stable societies don't produce golden ages, while others less obviously blessed do. It's not automatic or deterministic, but depends on choices, on cultural values, on individuals and institutions channeling resources and energy into creative and intellectual pursuits. The Gupta Golden Age happened because people chose to make it happen, because emperors patronized scholars and artists, because communities supported temples and universities, because individuals devoted themselves to perfecting their crafts and advancing their fields. This, in turn, leads us to understand something about how cultural achievement relates to political power. The Gupta Empire's greatest cultural achievements occurred during and shortly after its period of maximum territorial extent and political dominance. The military conquests of Samudragupta and Chandragupta II created the wealth and prestige that funded later cultural patronage. But the flowering continued and even intensified as political power declined, suggesting that culture has its own momentum, that institutions and traditions of excellence once established can sustain themselves even when the political structures that created them weaken. Indeed, some of India's finest temple architecture, sculpture, literature and philosophy were produced after the Gupta Empire's political collapse in the regional kingdoms that succeeded it. The Golden Age, in its cultural dimensions, outlasted the empire, continued in dispersed and varied forms across multiple centres, demonstrated that the patterns of excellence the Guptas had established didn't require political unity to persist. But there's another dimension to consider about what Golden Ages teach us. They're never universal experiences, never golden for everyone in the society. The cultural achievements of the Gupta period depended on social hierarchies that restricted most people's opportunities, on the labour of farmers and craftspeople who had little leisure for learning or art, on women whose roles were largely domestic and subordinate regardless of class. The Golden Age was genuinely golden in its achievements, in what it contributed to human culture and knowledge. But it was built on structures we would now consider unjust, maintained through social systems that restricted human potential based on birth, gender, caste. Recognizing both the achievements and their costs is important for honest historical understanding, for appreciating what was accomplished while acknowledging that it came at significant human cost for those whose labour supported the system but who shared little in its cultural benefits. This complexity is characteristic of all Golden Ages, all periods of great cultural achievement. They emerge from specific historical conditions that include prosperity and peace, but also social hierarchies, exploitation of labour, restrictions on who can participate in cultural and intellectual life. The achievements are real and valuable, worthy of study and admiration, but they don't exist in isolation from the social structures that made them possible. What we're left with, then, is a nuanced appreciation for the Gupta Golden Age. It represented a remarkable flowering of human creativity and intellect, produced achievements that enriched human culture in lasting ways, set standards for excellence that inspired later generations. But it was also a product of its time and place, operated within social structures we now recognise as limiting and unjust, served elites while depending on the labour and restriction of others. Understanding this complexity doesn't diminish the achievements, but places them in fuller context, helps us appreciate both what was accomplished and what the costs were, allows us to learn from the Golden Age while recognising that our standards for evaluating civilizations have changed, and so we come to understand, slowly, that history offers us not simple morals or unambiguous heroes, but complex realities that require careful thought and honest acknowledgement of both achievement and limitation as we move gently into the final act of our exploration, where we'll consider the enduring legacy and deeper meanings of this remarkable period. This is one of the most significant Indian contributions to world civilization, so fundamental to modern mathematics and science that we barely notice it. Every time we use Arabic numerals, every time we calculate using the decimal system, every time 0 functions as a number rather than just a placeholder, we're using innovations that emerge from the intellectual culture of Gupta India. The transmission path was long and complex, involving multiple translations and adaptations, but the Indian origin is clear. Indian astronomy also influenced the Islamic world, and through it medieval Europe. Indian astronomical texts were translated into Arabic, and Indian techniques for calculating planetary positions were incorporated into Arabic astronomical tables. Indian cosmological concepts influenced Islamic astronomy. The influence was selective and transformed, but it was real and consequential. But there's another layer to consider about cultural influence. Not everything influential is transmitted through texts or conscious borrowing. Some influences operate through subtler channels, through trade goods that carry aesthetic styles, through travellers who share stories and observations, through the gradual diffusion of techniques and ideas that become separated from their origins. Indian textiles influenced tastes and fashions across the ancient and medieval world. The fine muslins and colourful printed cottons from India were prized in Rome, in Arabia, throughout the Mediterranean. Their patterns and styles influenced local textile production, created demand that shaped Indian manufacturing, participated in the kind of cultural exchange that operates through material goods rather than texts or formal learning. Spices carried similar influence, transforming cuisines across Asia and Europe, creating demand that drove exploration and colonialism in later centuries. The desire for Indian pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and other spices influenced world history in profound ways, though the specific contributions of the Gupta period to this are harder to isolate from the broader pattern of Indian Ocean trade across many centuries. This, in turn, leads us to understand that cultural influence isn't always positive or benign. The very things that made India attractive to foreign merchants and scholars, its wealth and sophisticated culture, also made it a target for conquest and exploitation. The Muslim invasions of later centuries, the European colonialism that followed, were partly motivated by desire to control access to Indian wealth and goods, to dominate the trade routes and production that had made India prosperous. The Gupta Golden Age contributed to creating an India that was worth conquering, whose civilization impressed and attracted foreign attention, whose goods were valued enough to justify long and dangerous journeys to obtain them. The cultural achievements that we admire also advertised India's wealth and sophistication, making it both a contributor to and eventually a victim of global interactions. What we're left with is a complex picture of influence operating through multiple channels over long time periods, sometimes direct and traceable, sometimes diffuse and subtle, sometimes beneficial to both parties, sometimes creating vulnerabilities and inviting exploitation. The Gupta period's contributions to world civilization are real and lasting, in mathematics and science, in art and architecture, in religious and philosophical thought that spread across Asia. But these contributions operated within larger patterns of exchange and conflict, cooperation and conquest, that resist simple evaluation as simply positive or negative, leading us to consider how the memory of the Golden Age functioned within India itself across the centuries. Within India, the memory of the Gupta Golden Age served multiple purposes across the centuries after the empire's fall, functioning as both historical reference and mythical ideal, providing models for later rulers to emulate, standards against which to measure achievement, source material for imagination and longing for lost greatness. Later dynasties consciously modelled themselves on Gupta precedents, claimed connections to the Gupta legacy, sought to recreate the conditions that had produced the Golden Age. The title Maharajadiraja, Great King of Kings that the Guptas had used, was adopted by later rulers seeking similar prestige. The patterns of royal patronage for temples and scholars, the association of political power with cultural achievement. These became expected aspects of legitimate rulership partly because the Guptas had established them so successfully. The classical Sanskrit literary tradition looked back to Kalidasa and other Gupta period writers as supreme exemplars, models of excellence that later poets sought to equal or surpass. Literary critics and theorists referenced Gupta period texts as authoritative, as demonstrations of how literature should be written, how aesthetic effect should be created, how language could be used most beautifully and effectively. In this sense, the Gupta period became classical, not just temporally distant but normative, setting standards that defined what excellence meant. This canonization had both benefits and costs. It preserved and transmitted genuine achievements, created continuity in cultural traditions, gave later generations access to remarkable works and ideas. But it could also become restrictive, privileging ancient models over contemporary innovation, creating pressure to imitate rather than create, valuing conformity to classical standards over originality, which helps explain why memory of the Golden Age was never merely nostalgic, but functioned actively in later periods, used for various purposes by different groups and individuals. Rulers invoked Gupta precedents to legitimate their own authority, demonstrating that they were worthy successors to the great emperors of the past. Poets and scholars referenced Gupta achievements to argue for the value of learning and the arts, to claim continuity with glorious tradition, to position their own work within established cultural frameworks. But there's another dimension to consider about how Golden Ages function in cultural memory. They can become idealized to the point of myth, transformed from historical periods with complexity and contradiction into simplified visions of perfection. The Gupta Golden Age in popular imagination sometimes became a time when everything was perfect, when India was unified and glorious, when culture and learning flourished without the complications and costs that we've acknowledged in our examination. This mythologized Golden Age served particular purposes, providing comfort in times of division or foreign domination, offering proof that Indian civilization could reach great heights, giving hope that such heights might be reached again. During the colonial period, the memory of the Gupta Golden Age and other high points of Indian history provided evidence against colonial narratives of Indian inferiority, demonstrated that Indian civilization had achievements equal to or surpassing those of the West. The nationalist movement drew on these memories, used them to argue for independence, to imagine what a free India might achieve by recovering or recreating the conditions of the Golden Age. This wasn't merely manipulative myth-making, but reflected genuine connection to history, real pride in past achievements, legitimate use of historical memory to inspire contemporary action. Yet the mythologization also distorted understanding, created simplified narratives that erased complexity, made it harder to see the Golden Age clearly with both its achievements and limitations. The very success of the Gupta period in cultural memory could obscure the actual historical conditions, the costs and exclusions, the ways it was golden for some while restrictive for others. Building on this, we can understand how modern scholarship has tried to recover a more complex and accurate picture of the Gupta period, distinguishing what we can actually know from later elaborations and mythologies, acknowledging both achievements and limitations, placing the Golden Age in fuller historical context. This scholarly work doesn't diminish appreciation for Gupta achievements, but deepens it, shows the real conditions from which the Golden Age emerged, makes the accomplishments more impressive by showing the challenges and constraints within which they were achieved. The tension between historical accuracy and cultural memory is itself interesting, worth contemplating. Societies need their histories to function in certain ways, to provide identity and inspiration, to offer models and warnings, to create continuity between past and present. These cultural needs sometimes conflict with the scholarly commitment to complexity and accuracy, to seeing past societies in all their messy reality, rather than as simplified myths. What remains, then, is not a single memory of the Gupta Golden Age, but multiple memories serving different purposes, from scholarly reconstructions seeking historical accuracy to popular narratives providing inspiration and pride, from nationalist invocations claiming heritage to aesthetic appreciation of artistic and literary achievements. These various memories coexist, sometimes conflicting, sometimes complementing, all engaging with the same historical period, but finding different meanings and uses for it, as we drift toward considering what this ancient Golden Age might mean for us today. What lessons or insights we might take from our long exploration. As we approach the end of our journey through the Gupta Golden Age, it's worth pausing to consider what this distant civilization might ask of us, what questions it raises for our own time, what reflections it invites about achievement and limitation, about culture and power, about what makes an age truly golden. The Gupta period demonstrates that civilizational flourishing requires more than wealth and power, more than political stability and economic prosperity, though these provide necessary foundations. What transformed the Gupta Empire from merely successful polity into Golden Age was commitment to excellence, cultural values that placed high worth on learning and art, willingness to support creative and intellectual work that might have no immediate practical utility. This raises questions for our own age. We live in a time of unprecedented wealth and technological capability, at least in some parts of the world. We have resources that would have seemed miraculous to Gupta rulers and scholars. Yet we might wonder whether we're using these resources to create our own golden age, whether we're supporting the kinds of long-term intellectual and creative work that produce lasting cultural achievements, whether we're building institutions and traditions that will be admired by distant future generations. The Gupta commitment to learning, the support for universities like Nalanda where knowledge was pursued for its own sake, the patronage for poets and artists creating beauty rather than profit. These suggest that truly great civilizations invest in the intangible, support pursuits that don't generate immediate returns, understand that cultural achievement requires dedicated time and resources without pressure for quick results or measurable productivity. Which leads us naturally to consider the costs and exclusions that accompanied Gupta achievements. The Golden Age was built on hierarchies we now consider unjust, on restrictions we would find intolerable, on social systems that limited human potential based on birth rather than merit. This doesn't invalidate the achievements, but reminds us that cultural flowering has historically occurred within unjust societies, that there's no automatic connection between moral progress and cultural achievement. Our own age faces different challenges around justice and inclusion, around who gets to participate in cultural and intellectual life, whose voices are heard, whose perspectives are valued. We've made progress in some areas the Guptas would have found incomprehensible. Expanded participation beyond the narrow elites who created classical Sanskrit culture, questioned hierarchies that Gupta society accepted as natural and inevitable. Yet we have our own exclusions and hierarchies, our own ways of restricting who can participate fully in cultural and intellectual life. The question isn't whether we're perfect, but whether we're working towards systems that genuinely value human potential, wherever it's found, that support creativity and inquiry from all segments of society, that measure greatness not just by cultural achievement, but by how widely the benefits and opportunities are shared. But there's another layer to consider about what the Gupta Golden Age asks of us. The achievements we've explored in mathematics and literature, in sculpture and philosophy, in science and architecture, these weren't created by societies pursuing achievement for its own sake, but by people working within traditions that connected their efforts to deeper purposes, spiritual aims, cosmic understandings that gave meaning to the work beyond the work itself. Aryabhata wasn't just calculating planetary positions for technical interest, but investigating divine order, understanding cosmic patterns that reflected ultimate reality. Kalidasa wasn't just crafting beautiful verses, but evoking rasas, creating aesthetic experiences that had spiritual significance, using language to connect human experience with transcendent truths. The sculptors weren't just making beautiful objects but creating sacred images, embodying spiritual realities in stone. Our own culture often separates these domains, treats art and science as secular pursuits, independent of spiritual or cosmic significance, values achievements for their practical utility or aesthetic interest, rather than for what they might reveal about ultimate purposes or meanings. The Gupta example doesn't require us to adopt their specific religious beliefs or cosmologies, but it might invite us to consider whether our cultural and intellectual work gains something by connection to larger questions of meaning and purpose. This in turn leads us to understand that the Gupta Golden Age offers not simple lessons or direct models to imitate, but rather invitations to reflection, comparisons that illuminate our own assumptions and choices, demonstrations of possibilities that expand our sense of what human civilization can achieve. We can't recreate the Gupta Golden Age, wouldn't want to if we could given its costs and limitations, but we can learn from both its achievements and its failures, can use it as a mirror reflecting aspects of our own civilization, can find inspiration in its successes while avoiding its mistakes. The mathematical innovations we use daily, the artistic principles that influence traditions across Asia, the literary and philosophical achievements that enriched human culture, these emerged from particular historical conditions we can study and appreciate. But they also demonstrate human capacities that aren't limited to any single time or place, creativity and insight that remain available, excellence that can be achieved again through commitment and support, cultural flowering that's possible whenever conditions align and choices are made to pursue not just prosperity and power, but genuine civilization. What the Gupta Golden Age ultimately asks of us, perhaps, is to take civilization seriously, to recognize that how we use our collective resources, what we choose to support and value, what kinds of achievement we pursue and celebrate, these matter profoundly for what we create and what we leave to future generations. The Guptas created a golden age not accidentally, but through choices and commitments, through cultural values and institutional support, through individual genius working within enabling structures. We face different circumstances and challenges, but the fundamental questions remain: what do we want to create? What will we be remembered for? What are we building that will outlast our political structures and personal lives? These are the questions a golden age raises, and they remain as relevant now as they were 15 centuries ago, leading us to our final contemplation of time and memory and what endures. In the end, what survives from any civilization, from any human life, is fragmentary and transformed, separated from its original contexts, given new meanings by later generations, preserved in ways that would surprise and perhaps puzzle those who created it. The Gupta Golden Age demonstrates this poignantly, its achievements surviving but scattered, its monuments fragmentary, its living culture reduced to texts and objects that we interpret from vast distances of time and understanding. The mathematics endures most completely, the decimal system and zero functioning essentially as they did 15 centuries ago, used by billions of people who have no idea where these innovations originated. The practical knowledge has been separated from its philosophical contexts, from the cosmological understandings within which Indian mathematicians worked, becoming purely technical tools that anyone can use, regardless of cultural background or beliefs. The literature survives in texts carefully preserved and transmitted across centuries, studied by scholars, occasionally translated and read by wider audiences, but always at some remove from the living culture that produced it. We can read Kalidasa's plays, can admire the beauty of the language and the sophistication of the poetry, but we can't fully recover how they would have been experienced by their original audiences, can't recapture the cultural context that gave them their full meaning and resonance. The sculpture and architecture survive most precariously, vulnerable to destruction and decay, preserved in fragments that hint at former glories, but can't fully recreate them. We stand before a Gupta Buddha and see beauty and serenity, appreciate technical skill and aesthetic achievement, but we're seeing it as art in a museum rather than as a sacred image in a temple, experiencing it through our own cultural frameworks, rather than through the devotional context for which it was created. Yet this transformation isn't simply loss. The surviving achievements gain new significance through their survival, speak to later generations in ways their creators might not have anticipated, demonstrate qualities that transcend their original contexts and purposes. A Gupta sculpture can move viewers who know nothing of Buddhism, can communicate across vast cultural distances through its formal beauty and expressive power, can function as art even when separated from religion. And this connects to something equally important about how human achievement relates to time. We create within particular contexts for immediate purposes and audiences, embedded in cultural frameworks we often take for granted. But what we create, if it's excellent enough, can outlast these contexts, can speak to distant others, can find new uses and meanings we never imagined. The Gupta mathematicians who developed zero were solving specific problems within Indian astronomical and calendrical contexts, working within Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, pursuing knowledge that had both practical and spiritual significance for them. They couldn't have imagined that their innovation would become fundamental to modern science and technology, would enable computations they never conceived, would be used by cultures they never knew existed. This suggests something both humbling and inspiring about human creativity. We can't fully control or predict what will endure from our efforts, can't ensure that our work will survive or determine how it will be understood and used by later generations. But we can create with integrity and excellence, can pursue beauty and knowledge, can work within our own contexts while creating things that might transcend those contexts, might speak to distant others, might contribute to the long conversation that constitutes human culture across time. Building on this, we can understand why preserving and studying the past matters, why it's worth the effort to recover and understand civilizations as remote as the Gupta Empire. The past isn't simply dead and gone, but continues living through what it created, through influences that flow into our present, through knowledge and beauty that survive their original contexts. By studying the Gupta Golden Age, we're not just learning about history, but encountering human achievement that enriches our own culture, that expands our sense of what's possible, that demonstrates capacities we share across vast distances of time. The effort to understand is never complete or perfect. We work with fragments, interpret through our own biases and frameworks, create narratives that are partial and provisional. But the attempt matters. The patient work of scholars and archaeologists recovering evidence, the careful interpretations that try to see past societies on their own terms, the honest acknowledgement of both achievements and limitations. What time preserves and transforms ultimately is evidence of human capacity for greatness and limitation both, for remarkable achievement within unjust systems, for creativity and cruelty, for beauty and hierarchy. The Gupta Golden Age shows all of this, invites us to appreciate its achievements while acknowledging its costs, to learn from both its successes and failures, to understand it as a complex reality rather than a simple myth. Let that thought settle as we move toward our final moments together. 15 centuries separate us from the Gupta Golden Age. Vast changes in technology and culture, in politics and belief, in who we are and how we understand the world. Yet something connects across this distance, the shared humanity that created then and that creates now, the same fundamental capacities for thought and art, for seeking truth and making beauty, for building civilizations and wondering what they mean. The Guptas are gone, their empire dissolved into history, their living culture irretrievable. But what they created, what they achieved, what they demonstrated about human possibility, these endure, transformed but still present, still speaking, still enriching the human story of which we're all part. And so we arrive, gently, at our journey's end, ready to rest with these thoughts, to let the story of India's golden age settle into memory, to carry forward what it might teach us about excellence and limitation, about culture and time, about what humans can achieve and what endures. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey across 15 centuries, through 2.5 hours exploring India's golden age. We've travelled together from the fragmented kingdoms before the Gupta rise through the flowering of culture and learning, from mathematical innovation to literary excellence, from philosophical debate to religious transformation, from empire's height to its gentle dissolution. That's a considerable journey to take in a single evening. From the conception of zero that makes modern mathematics possible to the serene Buddha images that still speak across time, from Kalidasa's poetry to Nalanda's scholarship, from temple architecture to astronomical achievement, we've witnessed a civilization at its most creative and accomplished. The Gupta period showed what human culture can achieve when stability, prosperity and commitment to excellence align, when resources are devoted not just to power and wealth, but to learning and art, to beauty and truth pursued for their own sake. The answer to what makes an age golden, as honestly as I can give it, is this. A golden age emerges when a civilization chooses to be golden, when it values cultural achievement enough to support it generously, when it creates conditions where creativity and inquiry can flourish, when it produces not just wealth but beauty, not just power but knowledge, not just monuments, but ideas that endure. The Guptas made these choices, created these conditions, and the results enriched not just India but the entire human heritage. If you enjoyed this slow drift through ancient India, our like truly helps others find these calm explorations of history's quieter triumphs, and if you have thoughts about the Gupta Golden Age, about what it achieved or what it means, I'd love to hear them in the comments. To those who've been here before, thank you for returning. You make this community of curious minds seeking peaceful ways to end the day. Wherever you are in the world right now, in whatever space you've claimed for rest, I hope you're comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed, deepened, found its natural rhythm. I hope your thoughts have quieted, the day's concerns fading like colours in twilight. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, ready for sleep, released from the need to remain alert or active. Look up at the stars if you can, or simply imagine them there beyond the ceiling, the same stars that Aryabhata calculated and Gupta poets described, that witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the creation and preservation of beauty, the patient work of learning that accumulated across generations. All those distant suns, all that vast time and space, the incomprehensible scale of history and cosmos, and here we are, small and temporary, yet capable of creating things that matter, that endure, that speak across centuries to others we'll never meet. The Gupta Golden Age reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that political power is temporary, that empires dissolve into fragments and memories. But it also reminds us that what we create with care and excellence can outlast the structures that produced it, can speak to distant others, can contribute something lasting to the human story. The Guptas built temples that crumbled, but the principles of beauty they established still guide artists. They created an empire that fragmented, but the knowledge they advanced still serves us. They lived and died 15 centuries ago, but what they achieved continues. And perhaps there's comfort in that, in knowing that human achievement isn't entirely subject to time's erosion, that excellence endures even when contexts change, that what we create with integrity and skill might speak to others long after we're gone. The Gupta sculptors couldn't have imagined their Buddhas surviving into a world of electric lights and digital reproduction. Yet here they are, still serene, still beautiful, still communicating across impossible distances of time and culture. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this same long human story, this ongoing conversation across generations, this patient accumulation of knowledge and beauty that began long before us and will continue long after. Dream, if you will, of ancient India at its zenith, of scholars debating at Nalanda, of craftsmen carving stone into grace, of poets finding language for the inexpressible, of mathematicians discovering truths that would transform the world. Dream of temples rising, of ideas flowering, of a civilization reaching for excellence and finding it, creating a golden age that still glimmers across the centuries. Good night. May your rest be deep and peaceful. May tomorrow find you refreshed. And may you carry forward, in whatever small way, the commitment to excellence and beauty, to learning and creativity, to building things that matter and that might, in their own way and time, endure.